and welcome to OT Over Easy. My name is Becca, and today we are delving into a requested topic from my comments, frames of reference. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not excited for this one because theory is not what makes me jazzed about occupational therapy, but it is the basis of everything we do, so it is important to understand. Now, there are a lot of different frames of reference in the OT world. When I was doing my cursory first research for this video, I found like 36 different frames of reference. There's probably even more than that. I am not going to be talking about them all. It's too much. To start with today, I have whittled it down to 6. These are the most common ones that I saw mentioned across a variety of resources. They are ones that I remember learning when I was in school, and so I think these are ones that are most likely to come up when you are trying to read or learn this stuff for yourself. If you guys find this helpful, there's maybe another 10 or so that I think might be worth discussing. If there's one I don't talk about today, but you definitely feel like you need to know, drop it in the comments below and I'll consider talking about it if I make a follow-up video. But I could not bring myself to talk about all of these all at once. With regards for studying for an entry-level OT exam, you probably don't need to know a lot of the nitty-gritty about frames of reference. All they are frames of thinking for evaluation and intervention. So it's just, how are you approaching a patient? And similarly for the exam, you just need to know frames of reference so far as, how am I approaching the patient in this question? If the question is offering you, an age range, a diagnosis, patient's goals, that sort of thing, that might set you up to consider, okay, maybe I'm going to treat this person or look at this person through a biomechanical lens or a developmental lens. It is probably not going to ask you, here is a patient. What frame of reference should you use to address their needs? So don't worry about trying to study and memorize definitive things about every frame of reference. Just treat them as they are titled, a frame of reference. Think about them as a frame of thinking, a way of thinking, and that's really all you need, just so you have a varied approach when you're considering patients discussed in questions. With that in mind, let's crack on. We're gonna get started with an easy one to understand, good old biomechanical. The biomechanical frame of reference is focused on the physical body and physical functions of that body. Range of motion, strength, and endurance of body parts. Usually it's focused on orthopedic conditions like a broken bone, a lacerated tendon, something like that. And it's all about, how do we get that person moving? How do we get them stronger? This frame of thinking assumes that if we get the person moving better, then function will follow. For example, let's say you are treating someone who works as serving staff in a restaurant and they break their wrist. If you're using the biomechanical frame of reference, you may evaluate them and say, okay, let's measure range of motion in your wrist. Let's measure your grip strength. And if we're noticing deficits there, like, oh, you are not able to carry a tray. Well, I notice that you are only able to supinate your forearm by 45 degrees. The assumption is, if we can increase your flexibility, get you to rotate your forearm to 90 degrees, now you will be able to carry your tray. If you're not careful using the biomechanical frame of reference, you can get too focused on numbers. Like, all you care about is getting that forearm more and more supinated. But you need to consider the functional impact as well. Why does that person need to be able to bend their knee? Why do they need the endurance to walk a mile? Why do they need to be able to pick up 20 pounds? So a biomechanical frame of reference really should always be used as a component combined with other frames of reference that are more occupation-based. The developmental frame of reference is all about human lifespan development. Development is a relatively well-defined sequence from birth through adulthood. We're talking about fine motor skills, gross motor skills, cognitive development, social development, lots of known sequences. We have a pretty good understanding generally of what order we learn to do things, or in what order we acquire skills. So using a developmental frame of reference requires you to know what all of those sequences are. And then when you're evaluating a patient, you are trying to figure out, okay, what stage of development are they at now? So that you know what is the next stage of development. Where are you trying to move them to next? You're promoting development by mastering things in that sequence. Let's use handwriting skills as an example. Maybe you evaluate a 6-year-old child for their handwriting skills, and you find that they are using a palmar supinate grasp. You would know, based on general developmental sequences, that at 6 years old, really they ought to be developing a dynamic tripod or quadrupod grasp. If you don't know about handwriting grasp development yet, I do have a video on that. Check it out. If you do know the sequence of developing handwriting grasps, you know that you can't just skip from a palmar supinate grasp straight into a dynamic tripod. You're skipping over several steps. The next grasp after a palmar supinate grasp is a digital pronate grasp. So that is the grasp that you are going to work on mastering next with that child. So developmental frame of reference is all about just following those developmental sequences. Let's move next to neurodevelopmental theory, or NDT. NDT is used to treat movement impairments in neurological conditions like Parkinson's, cerebral palsy, or maybe after a stroke, with the understanding that skills can be developed. Hence, neurodevelopmental theory. Neurological conditions that we're going to develop movement patterns for. Handling a patient is a huge part of NDT-focused treatment. You're going to use guided movements, practicing movements, and postural strategies to help implement neuroplasticity principles to improve a patient's motion so that they can have improved function. It's somewhat similar to the biomechanical frame of reference in that we're largely focused on movement. It's just that in a biomechanical frame of reference, we're focused on more orthopedic things, again, broken bones, lacerated tendons, whereas with NDT, it's a neurological injury. So the brain is the primary organ that we are trying to exercise. Really, we're moving the body to engage the brain. So if you're reading a question and it's talking about neurological condition and it's mentioning posture and movement patterns, they're probably wanting you to approach this with an NDT focus. Next up is occupational adaptation. Model, theory, frame of reference. I have seen occupational adaptation called all of these things. In some literature, they combine them and it's all the same thing. I've seen in some sources they separate them and say, well, occupational adaptation model is different from occupational adaptation frame of reference. I am going to lump them all together here because when I have seen them separated, the concepts have overlapped greatly anyway. I don't really see the purpose in separating them into two different things. And dang it, if they wanted to be two different things, they should have picked two different names. This is why I couldn't do too many of these all in one video, because this is the sort of thing that gets me heated. And if I think about theory too long, I will get mad. Occupational adaptation, often abbreviated as OA, revolves around considering a person, their environment, and the interaction between the two. A person's desire to engage with an occupation combined with pressures from the environment to engage in that occupation combine into what we call a press for mastery. And this is the driving force behind learning how to overcome barriers or adapt. There is this cycle of adaptive response, response evaluation, response integration. You try a thing, you assess whether or not that thing worked, and if it did, incorporate that thing into how you approach an activity. Let's take an example of being able to pour a glass of water. Let's say in this scenario that I am the person and I have an intention tremor. My environment may include the physical environment of my kitchen and the social or cultural environment that expects me as an adult to be able to prepare food and feed myself, which includes pouring myself a drink. Personal factors and environmental factors coming together, making me desire to pour a glass of water, is the press for mastery. And again, the OA process is response, evaluate, and integrate. So my response to this challenge may be to use 2 hands to pour my glass of water. I then evaluate how successful it was, and if it helps, I'm going to practice that and try to integrate it as a habit. I've turned using 2 hands into an occupational adaptation. So using the OA frame of reference, your evaluation is going to include assessing the person and their environment and where those 2 things don't jive together. And intervention will be helping the client go through that occupational adaptation process, help them figure out what works for them, what adaptations work for them, and how to integrate those into daily life. Item 5 on today's docket is the rehabilitative frame of reference. This frame of reference may as well be called the compensatory frame of reference. It is a strongly top-down approach to therapy. If you're not familiar with that terminology, a top-down approach is going to be looking at big picture things. Bottom-up approach would be looking at small things and then figuring out how they feed into the big picture. So like a biomechanical approach is very bottom-up focused because you're looking at the nitty-gritty. Again, how many pounds can you squeeze? How many degrees of motion can you flex your wrist? And then you're like, okay, let's improve those so that you can, big picture, carry your serving tray. Using a rehabilitative frame of reference, top-down approach, we are entirely focused on what a patient can do and not at all on what they can't. There is no assumption that the patient will be able to develop new skills. So instead, we're focusing pretty much entirely on compensation. Again, big picture. What activities do they need to do? How do we get them to be able to do that? Why might someone not be able to develop new skills? How about a patient with a transradial forearm amputation? They've lost their hand. That hand isn't going to grow back. But again, with this frame of reference, we're focusing on what they can do. And maybe they can still bend their elbow. So maybe let's figure out how they can use that elbow flexion and engage their stump to participate in different occupations. Or maybe we'll consider getting them a prosthesis that they can operate with that elbow flexion and extension. How do we compensate for the loss of that hand? How about a patient with multiple sclerosis that is tired all the time? We can't use a bottom-up approach and say, oh, you have limited endurance. We'll just work out all the time to try to build up your endurance. This is a degenerative condition. You're not going to be able to improve their endurance, most likely. So, top-down approach. Look at the activities and the occupations. How do we adapt? How do we compensate to engage in the big picture stuff? If you have multiple sclerosis, let's talk about energy conservation techniques. Let's talk about pacing activities. Let's talk about planning activities, grouping things together, alternating high energy, low energy to give yourself breaks. Again, how do we compensate for your lack of energy? Rehabilitative frame of reference is all about saying, okay, you can't do that. Maybe you'll never be able to do that again. Let's focus on what you can do and how to utilize what you can do to make life happen anyway. Just lock into your head that the rehabilitative frame of reference is all about compensation. Let's switch focus next to the sensory integration frame of reference. This one is all about our sensory systems and how they interact with our environments. And the goal is always to facilitate participation in activities, Usually this is used with children. Intervention using a sensory integration lens may look like adapting the environment, like avoiding harsh lighting for someone who is sensitive to that, or teaching strategies like if a teenager is particularly sound sensitive and they know that they're going to go to a very busy mall, wearing headphones to help dampen the noise while they're in there so they don't get overly stimulated. But it's not just about compensatory strategies. Sometimes intervention will be directed at actually trying to improve those sensory integration systems, such as helping a child who is tactile defenseless explore different textures, play with them, become more tolerable to them so that they can participate in things like playing with dirt in the garden or helping to wash the dishes. Sensory integration theory and treatment, if you really get into it, is a lot to know. It is actually quite structured and definitely requires knowledge to implement beyond what you learn in OT school. Because it is a niche and requires specialty training, don't get bogged down in trying to understand everything there is to know about sensory integration if you're just trying to study to pass an entry-level exam. You won't need to know all of the terminology. You won't need to know all about how to implement it. Just be aware that it exists and be aware that it is an approach that sometimes is used, often in the pediatric population, sometimes with adults as well. And those are all the frames of reference that I have the stomach to teach right now. Thank you for requesting it in the comments. And again, if you found this helpful and would like me to keep going with some other frames of reference, please comment below. But for now, I hope this makes understanding OT theory a little more easy, and happy studying!